The romance of maps. You know those shows? Oh, maps are beautiful. Everybody loves maps. There are maps on on postage stamps, and they're mural-sized maps, and they make them on clay, and they make them on wood, and they draw them, and they paint them. Oh, maps are so wonderful. So if maps tell the truth about the world, and there's only one world, how can there possibly be so many different kinds of maps? I don't like the way maps think they know what the story is. I don't like their certainty. Cartography is a ridiculous idea. Cartography, as you well know, was an invention of the first third of the 19th century. An effort on the part of largely Germans, as a matter of fact, to elevate the practice of map making into a university quality activity. Cartography. It's a pretentious name for a bunch of nonsense.
Even the most simple topographic map or the most simple city map is already a manipulation. It's already representing the world as the one who has done the map sees it.
They're just too stripped down. They're too simple-minded to be believed. They reduce the world to roads and non-roads. And there is so much more to the world than roads and non-roads.
A map is a political intention. The data is political, a map is political. The map is so much an intellectual construction that it's far from depicting the reality. But it takes over the reality. When you map some things, and you'll see this in my work, obviously there is a part of real. It's like you write a novel based on real fact. So there is real fact on the map. But they are mixing with your imaginary, with your phantasm. This is a permanent dialogue between the reality and the imaginary, and it goes back and forth. And at the end you have an artwork, and the map is an artwork because it's made out of arts, colors, movement, fragrances, whatever.
It's been dead now, I would say, for 26 years. I arbitrarily picked 1992 as the year the map died. This is the year that the Power of Maps exhibition was mounted, and it's also the year that the Power of Map books came out. First of all, if cartography is dead, we can't have counter-cartographies. I mean, how can you have a counter to something that doesn't exist?
I'm still grappling with this concept. Counter to what? And to who? And who's looking at this map to say if it's counter or not, right? To whose eye is it catering? To which gaze is it performing this counterness?
If I think about indigenous mapping, that is, say, the mapping of indigenous populations of the territories that they believe were or should be or are theirs, I can understand that there's a counter going on there that's a distinct tension. You have your official map of Canada. This is the map that we would make of Canada as it was before you stupid Europeans arrived. I can see counter as a useful term there. But I can't see counter as a useful term for many of the maps that people count as counter cartographies.
But I think that the counter map might or might not be multivocal or try to be multivocal. I mean, it wouldn't be so sure of its own narrative, or maybe it should be, I don't know. I wouldn't have a clear definition of what is a counter map now. I'm looking forward all the time of exploring if this is in the first place possible in our times or not, to produce a counter map.
Why can't they just be map makers? Why can't they be counter map makers? Why can't they be angry map makers? I think that's what they need to be, angry map makers. And what they're angry about usually is that the way they've been left off the map, or the way the map construes their world in a way that they find distasteful.
When you get upset enough and you have an intention, then you go to collect data, information, qualitative and quantitative, and try to apply to those data some visual representation mode. This is how it happens. After, whether it is a sketch, whether it's a digitalized, full digitalized map, is something which is completely secondary to me. I don't really care. I stop to produce while the image is understandable enough for the people and reach the audience.
It's really interesting to see how different ways of charting space and time and relationships of power, but also relationships of resistance arise in different community contexts and from different community needs. So it's really, I think, exciting to see how different communities and groups and collectives put maps and spaces together.
Wow, that's wonderful. Well, I'm Dennis Wood, and somehow I've gotten involved in map making. I'm not quite sure how all that happened, but it did happen. Get rid of all the maps. If you get rid of all the maps, property disappears. With property goes the state, or the state disappears, and with the state goes property. If you get rid of the maps, all that goes away. It doesn't exist anymore. You can't point to anything and say, oh, this is... No, you can't do that. So the real thing to do is to destroy the maps. So the other thing you can do is you can attack the maps with other maps. You can present the world through a frame not given by the maps that we have. You can present your own, create your own frame, and show this is actually the world. That's not the world. That pretends to be the world, but this is the world. And you show them an alternative vision of the world. So if you want to make a map of it, you've got to confront the world. And if you want to make an interesting map of it, you really have to confront the world. And it means grappling with the world and its complexity, and somehow managing to distill out of that an image that you can print on a piece of paper. For me, thinking about it from the perspective of the map as opposed to the subject of the map, the subjects of these maps are usually very, very interesting subjects. And for that very reason, they're not going to show up on ordinary maps. They're not going to show up on Google Maps. They're not going to show up on topographic surveys produced by national mapping agencies. They're not going to show up in those kind of maps. So, first of all, they're very interesting. From the perspective of the map, they erode the idea of the map as a way of saying something certain about the world. If this is the world, how can this be the world? Well, they both can't be the world. So one of them's got to give. And the one that's going to have to give is, in the end, sooner or later, going to have to be the official mapped world. Now, what that also means is the world has to change, because for the last 500 years, the history of the map and the history of the world have become more and more deeply entangled. And we cannot have the world that we have right now without maps. Maps are the instruments that enable the nation state to be, to a substantial extent, the thing that it is. A thing with borders, a thing with a geobody. Those official maps mean that if you're going to fight those maps, you're going to fight the state as well. You're going to fight the idea of the state, you're going to fight the idea of private property, and we're going to find ourselves wading around among the anarchists and the Proudhonists and the, he was right, property is theft. The map is there to show us where the line is supposed to be, and we then go to that line and we defend it with tanks and soldiers and barbed wire. And this migrant crisis recently has been very illuminating in that way, in that it has surfaced the border in a way as a particularly important instrument. You know, to the extent that right-wing nationalists, they're built out of maps. They are literally built out of maps. They can make no other claim to their nationhood, which doesn't exist in any other way. It exists as an artifact of the map. Oh, it's detestable.
I'm Nermeen. I born and raised in Cairo, lived there for the most of my life, and now I'm in Amsterdam. Originally an architect, played a lot with maps, tried to make projects related to counter maps. Not sure if they all really are counter maps or not, but yeah. I started working on my thesis, which was an attempt to understand how the map, the earliest modern objective scientific map of Egypt, which is of course the French expedition production, had to do with the making of the modern state of Egypt and the production of the map and the production and of the state. And I was always asking, what is outside that? I mean, this is very, you know, I was stuck in a power structure, always pointing at it, but I was never really capable of producing something else. So I tried experimenting a little bit. We collectively redefined what is a legend. We collectively redefined where should it start or end, the extents, and what does it mean? Does a map of Port Said show Port Said only? No, because we were trying to map social history of people who were always on the move from a country to another, songs that are traveling throughout the Nile. I have been working on collecting these primary data that are oral histories, personal archives, newspaper. And I think that the most interesting thing is that we cannot read it after we finished it. And I think that this tells a lot about how complex and interconnected the stories were, and how many times does the state narrative interfere within the personal narratives or the routes of cultural production and music, etc. So I think in this complexity it told us a lot, but it also told us how to communicate this with a wider audience. People, when they saw the map, their only way to read it was to pick the string and keep on moving with it till a specific point. And of course that's, you know, kind of a limitation, but also a potential, but it is not easy to navigate it. It is not easy to read it. It is not easy to decipher it. Was, for example, something I was thinking a lot about, that I really enjoyed that they took the strings, that they felt that they can, you know, deal with it and touch it. And also this idea of, you know, how to decipher a very complex reality, right? Especially when we are speaking of mapping social history, how to break this down into simple lines that are readable and manageable. What does it say and mean, and why are those very silent parts of the city turned out to be, in terms of memory? People just don't have memories here, you know, and they are the hugest, vast urban space of the city, while others, all the memories are reserved for those 2-3 streets.
I'm Erin McElroy, and I'm based out of the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm a co-founder of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. One of the ways that gentrification functions is through charting space and mapping, and, you know, real estate agents and speculators and landlords are constantly mapping space so that they can gentrify areas and benefit, capitalist interests. So for us to kind of understand how those players work and where evictions are happening, requires mapping and requires understanding these chains and nodes of power and wealth and technology. So, for us, making those maps is a way to fight gentrification and to strategize with our different community partners how to fight back and how to stay in our homes and communities. So. The anti-eviction mapping project right now has expanded. We've got a chapter in Los Angeles and New York, but we're mostly based out of the San Francisco Bay Area. So we're suddenly making new maps in new locations, which means having to think about spaces differently and histories differently. Even though we're already plugged into the community in different ways, we really want to make sure that anything that we make is useful. So we always work with different community partners, sometimes eviction clinics, sometimes art collectives, sometimes youth groups. And then sometimes we'll, do something like make a mural or a report or this or that, and then have a community event where everybody involved can get together in real space. So after a year of just building community partners and mapping a lot of loss and a lot of displacement in Oakland, one of our community partners, the Betty Ono Gallery, challenged us to actually think about how it might be useful to also map what's still there, and not just to make these maps of displacement, but to map sites of power and community resources. And we had these two walls that were just basically a canvas of Oakland, and people could chart what they considered a community resource or a point of power, and also some stories of loss and resistance. And so after having that up for a couple months, we digitized the contents, and now it lives online and people can still add to it digitally.
It's a way to create new commons. To produce a map, a counter map, it's to think about new commons. And that, I think, it's also a way to make action in our present. We have not just bureau d'études. We are in different collectives, and that it's also important. Okay. Bureau d'études, we create that as a common name. Bureau d'études is like a bureau or office for studies, and it's a common name. And we make some mapping since 20 years. Mostly in the beginning it was about the structure of capitalism and the relationships between banks and industries. One aim was to define some enemies, to know where we are, because when we make some action, we think that we can change, in a way, the system. But we can see that the capitalist system is very integrated, with a very high level of hierarchy and control. Then it's a real question how we can make some action, not just tactical action, but strategical action. Because mostly when you have question of mapping, in a way it's tactical action. You have a specific place, and it's how we can organize some groups and in a specific place. But if you zoom out and you see the very big structure, and we make this work, for example, for the French state, you see that you have very complex system, but very organized system of control. And it's not so easy to understand how it's possible to act, to change this system. You can act in this part or this part or this part, but you can make some small action, and that it's very meaningful to do that. But you have also the problem of the big system and what we do with that. And the first step is to have no illusion with that. Then it was also a problem for us. Is it good to adopt this point of view, or if we must to change the point of view on mapping, to have not just an analysis of the system? It's useful, but it's also not sufficient. And it's a reason we decide to move to the countryside to have a scale 1 approach of mapping, and to change the point of view also about information, about how we can represent or how we can have a consciousness about the system, to try to change the ontology of mapping. And now we are more in this question. We are in a very rationalized system, and it's a way to reinvent ontologies, other ontologies, and to create other world inside this system. That it's the reason it's a way to create new commons. A question is also very important for counter mapping. Is yes, I am here and I have I live there and I have an existence now, and it's with these limits and that I make some action, and that is my power. And you can have no, you can have despair, but you continue to make action, and that I think it's the situation now. Produce the representation, but also to diffuse.
What we would like very much to do, we would like to show how finding new way of new cartographic narrative, new way of representing the world, nouvelle écriture cartographique, as you would say in French. I'm not sure about an English translation, but new cartographic expressions or writing would really help for the general public, for the audience which is not familiar with the maps, to better understand how trapped they are in the, okay, let's say the world. This is a capitalism system which is eating them more and more. I don't like to use this word, but at least this is what it is now. So, my name is Philippe Regasevich. I'm a geographer by training. I've studied in Paris, La Sorbonne University, and then I immediately almost entered the newspaper, French newspaper, Le Monde Diplomatique. And also in charge, because I was geographer, to produce this pretty famous series now of Atlas of Geopolitics. There was 4 editions along 12 years. So that means also creating a language, a cartographic language that the audience could understand. And then what we wanted to do with this was approaching the geopolitics in a different way. The maps is the prefiguration of my belief and my intention. So making maps is first of all to read a lot, to be extremely curious, and to find within the society, within all what you see, all what you read, issues that you get upset to. And this is what radical cartography is, or critical cartography is. You use the map really as a very brutal tools to make the world know things which are totally unacceptable. Radical cartography is very simple. First, deconstruction. Second, action on the field. Phase 1, deconstruction, understanding how the things are organized, trying to deconstruct the system and describe it. At the end of phase 1, there is a conclusion. You face a situation of discrimination, of inequality, too much control, too much surveillance, too much speculation, or something unacceptable like grabbing of public goods or public lands or public territories, I think. The phase 2 is an action on the field that leads to oblige the state or the power, let's call it the power, to go reverse, to go backwards, to renounce to their project, to say, okay, we tried it, we tried to grab your lands, we understood you get extremely upset, so we go backward and then we let it public. Duty-free shop, that was easy when we've been investigating on the Oslo airport with the closure of all the public corridor and the things. We have been deconstructing the place, we have been drawing the things.
The goal of transporting people is exactly the same of the goal of making people shop, like the new normal. Something which is totally abnormal become normal, and they are working very hard for this.
But at that time, that was really something completely new, that people suddenly discovered that they have been forced into 250 meters of shop.
The situation in 2005, where you had really an extremely pleasant public space with a direct access to the embarking gate and a small duty-free shop where you could buy your salmon and your pullover. But the benefit was very little and was too little, so they decided in 2006 to completely change the system and extend this duty-free shop and make the people enter here, create a barrier of trolley and let only 50 centimeters. But that was not enough, because still only 40% of the people which were entering this shop, and the rest was taking this corridor because it was very visible and very obvious that that was the way to go to the door. But then they closed this door and they were forcing the people to go all the way at the end of the shop to come back here to take their flat here. But that was not enough, and in 2007 they decided to extend the shop again. And here, according to my statistics, it was depending days and afternoon and how the crowd is busy or on a hurry, between 85 and 92%. So it's very good way. And as soon as you enter this duty-free shop, it's clear that you will buy something, especially because at the end, when you get out, somebody is asking, have you bought something?
Asking TV and newspapers to come over, show the map in big within the airport. They came with the camera, with the photography, and they understood that that was totally unacceptable. And they stopped, they reopened the public corridor, and they cleaned it, and they re-put some fountains where you could drink, and then some benches where you could sleep outside of the shop. So that was phase 1 deconstruction, and phase 2 you make it public, and then you act on the field and you try to reverse the tendency.
So I really like seeing how things relate to each other. I like especially when maps do interesting things, kind of counter maps especially, that defy more like neoliberal and colonial ways of understanding space. And I like when maps can help us fight gentrification and other social injustices. So.
It depends upon how this mapping process and where and why did it happen, who did it, etc. You can do a community map, but then it could be erased next morning because the state doesn't want it. So, I mean, also about how much controls you have about this over the space and the map itself, where the medium you use, is it digital, is it analog?
And I just wanted to think for a second, are the people who make Google Maps cartographers in any way, shape, or form? I can't believe they are. I bet they're just computer guys writing code.
Probably.
You know, if they're controlling the maps, you could control your maps. You could make your own maps.
There is a hype now. Everyone wants to produce a counter map. Why? Because it's a good way to visualize the other, like the other sound, the other voice.
What they are teaching us, working a little bit solitary, this is the participative way, the way they work collectively. That's a model. Because this is extremely difficult to gather people which have very strong personality to work together, to share their knowledge, and to just produce something, because we are always afraid to be robbed of our art, of our talent, and our ID. We are giving up ourselves, or what we are, You will find our name maybe sometimes, but that's not the most important. So the collective, learning the collective way to work is really what is the most inspiring when you observe and when you talk with those counter mapping people.
Forget that this photographic image, because when we see this landscape, we see that as a photography. Then we have in the structure of vision, we have the structure of capitalism, because we see that as a stocks and yes, as capital. And the mapping is also a way to go out from this naturalist approach of the reality. And it's a reason it's also so important. Yes.
There's something romantic about them, as in the romance of making maps, the romance of maps. I mean, that's the most loathsome phrase that I know. But there is something alluring about the miniaturization. I don't know. It's like, you know, you see a bird flying through the air, and the bird comes down and lands on your hand, and you can hold the bird up close and look at it. That's what the map is. It's like looking at the bird up close, the bird that has landed on your hand without being called, you know? I don't know if that ever happens to real humans, that birds come down and land on their hands. But if it did, that would be what the map is. It's that,